48. The Key. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 to 11. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And if it be meet that I go also, they shall go with me. Now I will come unto you when I shall pass through Macedonia, for I do pass through Macedonia. And it may be that I will abide, yea, and winter with you, that ye may bring me on my journey whithersoever I go. For I will not see you now by the way, but I trust to tarry a while with you, if the Lord permit. But I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost. For a great door and effectual is opened unto me, and there are many adversaries. Now if Timotheus come, see that he may be with you without fear, for he worketh the work of the Lord, as I also do. Let no man therefore despise him, but conduct him forth in peace, that he may come unto me, for I look for him with the brethren. Reading Paul is different from reading the rest of the New Testament. Paul's writings are immensely charged emotionally as well as intellectually. He expresses himself in a way that is more reminiscent of the Old Testament. When you read the prophets of the Old Testament, you find that it is quite an experience, because the men give so free expression to their passionate feelings. Not many people ever read the book of Jeremiah all at one sitting. It would be a draining emotional experience. The grief of the man, his blunt expression of what he suffered, what he went through. It is painful to read, painful to take all in one dose. And the same is true of the other prophets, major and minor. In the New Testament, men do not express themselves in the same highly charged way. You can read, for example, the beautiful letter of John, his first letter or second and third, and be profoundly moved. But there is not much of John as an emotional person, as someone deeply involved in what he is doing and hurt by what he sees. The early New Testament writers are not comparable to Paul in this regard. Paul, in all his letters and in the last chapter, gives space to things personal, little odds and ends of counsel, news, and also a remembrance of persons. Again, this is unlike, say, John or James. Paul thus is, as far as the New Testament is concerned, in a class by himself. He is more like an Old Testament prophet in the way that he expresses himself. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapters 1 to 15, corrects and rebukes the Corinthian church at great length. Their sins are very specifically cited, and prompt action required. One would expect that Paul would have let the matter rest here. Instead, because there is a famine in Judea and near desperate conditions in Jerusalem, what Paul does is to require them to give generously to help the Jerusalem believers. In this, Paul follows a precedent required by biblical law and practiced by the Jewish community. Paul says he has given orders to the churches of Galatia, and he likewise so orders the Corinthians. His premise is stated clearly in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25. For we are members one of another. This rests also on Ephesians chapter 5, verse 30. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. Being one with the Redeemer, they are members of one another as his new humanity. This means care and concern for one another, both materially and spiritually. One consequence of this in church history has been a massive outpouring of funds to meet the needs of suffering Christians, at least through World War I, and since then as well. Paul expects the Corinthians to give readily and freely. He speaks in advance of their liberality in verse 3. Very early, the church in its history manifested this liberality, so that Paul, in writing to a wayward church, still expects a generous outpouring of gifts. Paul stands in readiness to go to Jerusalem together with their gifts. Verse 4. Statist charity was very prominent in the New Testament era among the people of Rome. The majority of people lived on bread and circuses and housing freely provided for by Rome. A great deal of construction in the major cities of the Roman Empire was statist Roman construction with tax money. And, as against this, here comes the early church saying, "No, we meet our needs." Paul sees every evidence to believe it will also be notable among Christians. Paul plans to see the Corinthians again when he passes through Macedonia. Verse 5. In fact, he hopes to spend some time there with them, perhaps to winter in Corinth and gain the assistance of the Macedonians for the balance of his journey. The route of his journey depends on God's calling. For the present, he plans to stay at Ephesus until Pentecost. Verse 8. For the Corinthians, Paul's coming and his possible stay in Corinth was not pleasing to all, as we shall see. Paul could be unsparing in his correction, however loving in purpose. Thus, Paul in person posed a problem to some. Meanwhile, Paul planned to stay in Ephesus until Pentecost, he says, "For a great door and effectual is opened unto me, and there are many adversaries." Verse 9. Paul was a man of great and remarkable talents. A study of his vocabulary alone tells us of his sharp awareness of problems and evils in the Roman order. His was a remarkable and inspired grasp of the problems within Rome and the sharp line between the Roman realm and the kingdom of God. Some scholars have tried to make of Paul the real founder of Christianity, an absurd view. Paul was prepared by God to see the fullness of the meaning of Christ's coming in life and of the kingdom of God as none other. His importance in the history of Revelation is very great and fully in line with the law and the prophets, so that the opposition of the leaders of Judaism was a natural one. Paul saw the lines of division with an intense clarity. Paul turns now to the possible coming of Timothy, his protege. He insists that Timothy's coming be without fear. Verse 10. Because of his closeness to Paul, some might seek to take action against Timothy for Paul's sake. Now, Paul responds to this possibility by saying, "He worketh the work of the Lord, as I also do." Verse 10. Instead of separating Timothy from himself, Paul ties him very clearly to himself, so that any offence against Timothy will be one against Paul as well. "Let no man therefore despise him, but conduct him forth in peace, that he may come unto me, for I look for him with the brethren." Verse 11. Paul thus makes clear that any fault-finding with Timothy will be seen as an attack on himself, Paul, for they share a faith and a calling. Paul's greatness is the sheer extent of his grasp of the meaning of Jesus Christ, his work and his kingdom. It was not his, quote, originality, end quote, that makes Paul great, but his faithfulness to the whole of the revelation that preceded him. The hatred of Paul by unbelieving scholars is thus great, because Paul's focus compelled an awareness of the whole of the biblical revelation. Thus, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 17 to 21, Paul summarizes what and who Jesus Christ is, and his definition is a classic statement of biblical faith. Evangelicalism is not imaginable without Paul, nor is Calvinism. Not because Paul invented them, but because he so sharply and clearly defined them. Precisely because Paul understood so fully the meaning of Jesus Christ, his humility and reverence in dealing with him is so marked. Jesus is the Lord from and of glory, and to know him is to have the key to meaning and to being.